This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden, and this is a podcast where, since 2017, I discuss all things religion with a variety of fantastic scholars, experts, authors, and educators. On this episode, I got to learn about cancer survival, the concept of futurism, the work of Lee Edelman, and much more with Dr. M. Cooper Minister. Dr. M. Cooper Minister is Associate Professor of Religion at Shenandoah University, where they teach courses on death, medicine, sex, gender, and theories of religion. Their books include Rape Culture on Campus and Cultural Approaches to Studying Religion, an Introduction to Theories and Methods, co-edited with Sarah Bloesch. Their current project is a memoir about being diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at age 33 and learning to persist in between life and death on the dance floor. We discuss each of these topics and more, and I took away so many lessons and ideas to consider from this conversation. This episode does contain strong language in case you are not listening privately. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. M. Cooper Minister. Dr. M. Cooper Minister, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It is a delight to have you here on the show and to chat about your work. I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name is Cooper Minister, and I am an expert in religion and health because I've studied religion and culture for more than a decade. I have a PhD, and I've been teaching medical ethics for the last 5 years. And I consider myself an expert in religion and health also because of my own experiences having submitted my body to the medical system as a patient with stage 4 cancer.
We're going to get into all of that. I'm so excited. There's so much there already that we're going to dive into in a few minutes. And I want to know a little bit about your academic path first. The areas of interest that led you into this profession in the first place, any major turning points or sources of inspiration that led you into pursuing theology and religion in general in the first place.
Yes. So my professional interests have always been tied to my personal interest. And I haven't always been able to be honest about that because I think it made me feel like less of an academic. So I couldn't be honest with myself and I couldn't be honest with others. But as I look back through the trajectory of my work over the years, it's really obvious to me that there is a consistent connection between my personal questions and my academic professional studies. So I went straight from undergraduate into master's work into a PhD program. So my questions that I entered undergraduate with continued to influence me throughout my studies. I grew up evangelical and I went to a Southern Baptist university to study theology. At that point, I had been socialized to be a woman, and I was limited by the roles that women could play within that context. And so my academic projects were all about trying to find loopholes for gender roles in the church. So I learned Greek, and I did all of this work on 1 Timothy 2:11, which is women shouldn't teach or exercise authority over men. And I looked at all of these. I was like, oh, there are hapax legomena in this verse, which means that these words only show up once in the whole New Testament. So we don't have a lot of corroborating information to really be able to know what they mean. So it was just really invested in understanding the biblical text, looking for these loopholes around gender roles. And so I spent a lot of my time trying to find space for myself within a system where I felt really constrained. And so then I went to Boston University for my master's work. And that was a real turning point for me because I got introduced to feminist theology and other ways of thinking theologically where I didn't have to be so dependent on how I was interpreting the Bible. And then for my PhD work, I went to Southern Methodist University. And that was yet another turning point where I got much more interested in questions about humans and how we relate with each other, as opposed to questions about God, which had sort of been forming my theological studies before that. So while I was at SMU, I got really interested in religion and culture and began to do a lot of work around that. And so I've had other turning points since then. I graduated from SMU in 2011. So there have been things, but those are my most foundational sorts of turning points.
So I want to know a little bit about your current research agenda. I know that you are largely working within death and medicine, sex and gender. Tell me a little bit about where you see yourself as a scholar and researcher and writer these days.
Yes, those topics are exactly what I consider myself to be doing these days. And the interest in sex and gender goes way back, as you can tell from those early undergraduate questions, but it's changed too. So I'm now much more invested in queer negativity and interested in some of those questions, which is kind of an intentional refusal to be okay with the world that we've created and how we've created with it. The interest in death and medicine goes way back too. My mom worked for hospice growing up, and so she helped people die. And so my brother and I, and it wouldn't happen on a schedule. So my brother and I would end up in a nursing home waiting room, and she would ask us to be good and promise us McDonald's if we were good. And so we would just be sitting in a nursing home waiting room, waiting for someone to die so that we could get McNuggets, which is a really unique way to grow up with death. And I didn't really realize that people didn't have the same experience with death that I had until I was an adult. And people were really afraid of death. And I was like, this is just everyday occurrence. Like, this happens all the time. People die. You know, if you're good, you get McNuggets. And so that's just, it's a very casual way of thinking about death. And it's not something that it's not a way that a lot of people think about it. And of course, when I was 33, then I was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, and that put me in much more proximity to death than I ever imagined I would be at this point in my life.
I do want to know a little bit more about that diagnosis in general. I mean, do you have any just general overview reflections on that time, like what that felt like, and like immediately what you started to notice about how your own life was changing immediately?
Yes. So one of the first things that I noticed was that other people really wanted me to get better. And that was so a little bit stunning for me. I wanted to get better too, obviously. I didn't want to have cancer, and I wanted to go back to how things were before. But I also really had this sense deep down that that was not going to happen, that there was no going back after something like this, that things were going to change. And so I felt this real disjunction between that really deep sense of knowing that I had, whether I died or survived, that everything was different now, and these what felt to me like demands from other people that I get better. And so I started to think a lot about that in terms of the cure and our belief in the cure. I was using my tools as a religious studies scholar and our investment in the cure. And my own oncologist, in my first meeting with him, what did he say? Our goal is to keep you alive long enough so that we can find a cure. I was just really flabbergasted because I was like, you think we're going to find a cure in time for it to matter with someone who was just diagnosed with stage 4 cancer? That optimism to me, it was so unrealistic. I just wanted people to be able to be more realistic about what was happening to me. And so, yeah, I found that to be really isolating and difficult.
I see. I know that you're writing a memoir about this diagnosis of stage 4 colon cancer. Tell me a little bit about how that project is going, where you're at with it, what the process has been like.
Yeah. So it's a memoir about being diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at 33, outliving my prognosis, and learning to live in between life and death on the dance floor. So the process has been much more involved than I realized it was going to be. I'd written some academic books before, but this has been a project that has required me to learn how to write differently. And so I've been thinking a lot about creative nonfiction and learning how to tell scenes and create affects instead of just explain what I think I know, then also not doing that. So putting that in there as well. So I'm have a draft and I'm working on it and it's in process. I'm hoping that it will come out at some point, but there's no specific trajectory for that right now.
Wonderful. Very cool.
Yeah.
I love talking about creative nonfiction on the podcast. Like years ago, I talked to somebody named Shulam Dean about his book about leaving an
I've
Orthodox
read
Jewish
that.
community. Amazing
Hmm.
book. I
Yeah.
read Shoes Outside the Door by Michael
Hmm.
Downing about the San Francisco
Hmm.
Zen Center. So I am publicly inviting you to come back on the podcast sometime to talk about that book when it comes out, because I love creative nonfiction, especially within the field of religion too. So I feel like we really need to do a part two on that book someday when it comes out.
That sounds great. Yeah, I would really love that.
Love it.
Um, yeah.
So let's talk about a paper that you sent me, provocatively titled. I am delighted to read this title on the podcast. Fuck the Survivor, Refusing the Promised Future by the Sanctified Cancer Patient. Tell me the origin of this essay that you sent to me for the podcast.
So in many ways, this essay brings together those threads of sex and gender and death and medicine. And I wrote it when I got invited to contribute to a volume on Lee Edelman and the study of religion when I was just a few months out of my initial rounds of cancer treatment. So the title is a play on something that Lee Edelman says in No Future whenever he's talking about the child as a figure that we invest in, because children represent our hopes in the future. So he says something like, and he's being polemical, but he says, fuck the social order and the child in whose name we're collectively terrorized. Fuck Annie, fuck the waif from Les Mis. And so I was thinking about this and thinking about cancer survivors and how cancer survivors are also used to shore up our investment in and our hope in the future. And I was like, oh, fuck the survivor. And then I also went on for a minute because I was mad and I was like, fuck the chemo chairs, fuck the beautiful smiling bald women, fuck the people with their arms raised under those posters at the end of Races for the Cure, fuck the whole thing. And so I wrote this piece. I was angry when I wrote the piece, and I think the title really reflects that. But I also still like it. I have a love-hate relationship with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's say a little bit more about the title too, because I'd imagine that people out there listening who do have personal experiences with cancer within their own family might find that to be something very troubling. How would you address that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that it's troubling because there's a sense that you can't admit that we are fucked, but it's not something that we can say publicly, and it's not something that we're allowed to talk about because of all of these narratives. And that goes for people with cancer themselves. Like, we need these narratives to live into, and so, or a lot of us do. And so people who are troubled by this, I sympathize with that because I understand how these narratives hold us up socially and put us in community with other people. And I am less invested in forming community and relationship those ways, and much more interested in creating relationships in different sorts of ways. And so I know that it's troubling, but I think that it's important.
I've also never had cancer. I don't know what this experience is like. So for someone like me, who's never had an experience like that, I feel that this title was really useful for me because it really showed my own limitation of my understanding of the emotional aspect behind being diagnosed with cancer and being like, Wow, I never would have thought of this title in a million years, but I also don't know what that experience is like. And if this happened to me, maybe I would feel exactly the same way.
Yeah. And I do think that it's not just my experience, it is an experience that I have picked up from a lot of young adults with cancer. I'm now friends with a lot of young adults with cancer. And it is something that we share collectively, this frustration with these demands that are put on us. And so this is also a way of acknowledging that this is not just my experience, but it is an experience that a lot of young adults with cancer have.
I see. So I want to dive into a little bit of the concepts within the piece as well.
Mhm.
You use something called futurism a lot. This
Mhm.
term, which I've never discussed on the show before. I love discussing brand new things on the show. So tell me a little bit
Right.
about futurism.
Sure. So futurism, according to Edelman, is about a narrative sequence that doesn't enable change. A lot of times when we think about the future, we think about change. But according to Edelman, futurism is a narrative sequence that actually reinvest us in repetition, in sequence, in the past, and what come before. And so it's turning us back onto the same story while acting like it's something different. And so it's not enabling change in the way that we often think that it is. And so we might think about how gender repeats itself through the binary and it's different. Oh, but it's not different. But I'm particularly also interested in thinking about how people diagnosed with life limiting illnesses like stage 4 cancer are also expected to turn back into life affirming narrative sequence. So even whenever you're diagnosed with an incurable illness, you still have to affirm life with things, by you're so brave, you're such an inspiration. Things could be worse. That's a good one. These are all attempts to demand that people with cancer shore up narratives about survival that help project everyone into the future. And it's not a future that's that different. It's a future that is the same.
Mm. I'd love to know a little bit about the ways that you've observed how people are spoken about with their people around them in their lives. How does the way we talk about people change when cancer enters their life story?
Right. So again, people really want to invest a lot of hope in people with cancer and expect them to get better. And part of what I've found is that those investments in other people, when someone gets cancer, all of those hopes and what I call demands also that are put on people with cancer are often about the people with the hopes or demands themselves and their own fear of death. And so they want people with cancer to get better to shore up their own fear of getting sick and their own fear of dying. And so it's presented as a form of caretaking. I really want you to get better, or you're such an inspiration. Thank you so much, for being such an inspiration. But then it becomes a demand, and the person with cancer ends up doing caretaking whenever they actually really need a lot of care. And I can say that personally. I ended up doing a lot of caretaking whenever I really needed a lot of care, just
Mm.
to shore up people's narratives. And so that was also why I got really interested in thinking more about death and our avoidance of it, because I, we need to do better for people with cancer. We need to be, I think, less afraid of death, be able to talk about it more so that we don't put those demands and expectations on people whenever they get faced with this
Mm.
thing that happens.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself sort of a part of like the death studies subfield within religious studies? Because I want to make sure that you have a chance like tie in religion a little bit as well. Or do you
Mhm.
consider yourself sort of a part of that field of death studies?
I have not in the past, and but I have to be honest that more and more my work is doing that. But I one of the things that one of the ways that I'm thinking about death that I think is not necessarily, it's part of death studies, but is maybe a little bit of a unique route into death studies, is in thinking about death in terms of queerness and self-shattering and negativity. And so I think all of those things for me are tied up together. And that's a little bit of a different way of thinking about death than I see represented in a lot of religion and death studies. There's a lot of religion in there because a lot of these narratives are Protestant and they're Christian, and
Yeah.
certainly the ways that we produce them are. So it is absolutely religion and death studies,
Cool.
if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
I just wanted to give you a chance to like clarify like that. And it's really cool to see how I get the sense that your career has taken some twists and turns along the way. So I love seeing the ways that your interests have kind of waxed and waned throughout the years. I think that's really cool when people are, when they follow new roads instead of like sticking in one single lane. I think that's really cool. I like seeing diversity within
Yeah.
people's work. It's awesome. So I want to know about, so let's think about surviving really quick. Okay. So people survive stuff all the time. People survive car accidents, people survive domestic violence or other acts of violence. How does cancer surviving differ from other kinds of survival, like a car accident or an act of violence in another way?
When I got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, I was working on a book on rape culture on college campuses. So I was thinking a lot about survival within the context of sexual assault and reading a lot about that. And pretty immediately, I made a connection between cancer survivors and survivors of sexual assault. I resisted that for a minute. I was like, these are two really different things. And then I sort of come in and out of this similarity between them. One of the ways that I've come down and thinking about it is that there are types of survival where there's an event and something that happens and then you move on from it. And there are types of survival where the event is ongoing. And so that's different. Whenever you are going back over and over and over, it's repetitive, it's coming back. So in the cancer land, you're going back to the chemo chair, you're having more surgeries, the tumors are coming back. That's not everyone's experience with cancer. It was mine for a minute. And so there was an ongoingness to it. And still, even now, there's an indeterminacy to the ongoingness of the event. But I think that that's a really different from an event that happens and then you move on from it. And so I'm less interested in thinking about sexual assault survival is like this and cancer survival is like that, than in thinking about that difference where you have an ongoingness and where you have an event and then you have it doesn't go on in the same way as the event that repeats.
Interesting. And you just mentioned that book. Is the book that you were referring to Rape Culture on Campus and Cultural Approaches to Studying Religion?
The book that I just mentioned was Rape Culture on Campus. And I was also working on an edited volume at the time, a couple of edited volumes, Cultural Approaches to Studying Religion. And then the other one
Two
is the
separate books.
Bloomsbury Reader, 3 separate books.
Wow.
Because there's a Bloomsbury Reader, but those 2 are edited. And also, so when I got sick, one of my coping mechanisms was I said to the gastroenterologist, what about my books? Which is really ridiculous. But I was concerned, and I was co-editing the books that I was editing. I was co-editing with my closest colleague and friend, Sarah Bloesch, and I was really concerned about being able to live up to the things that I had said that I was going to live up to in our work together. And I really believed in what we were doing and wanted to be able to get these books out into the world. And so I that was something that just came out of my mouth when I was getting diagnosed, which is really ridiculous. But really ridiculous things come out of your mouth whenever you're in situations like that, or at least that's my experience.
The message that gets sent to people with cancer about what life will be like after they get better versus how it actually goes, I can't imagine that those are very similar. Can you tell me a little bit about what the message is like to people while they have cancer versus what life might tend to be like after they go into experience a period of remission or something like that?
Yes, absolutely. And the first thing that I want to do here is plug the cancer patient if you're on Instagram, because I love this account. It was not an account when I got diagnosed, but it really, the memes there just really capture this experience well for me. And it pokes fun at cultural narratives that put these expectations on young adults with cancer. So one of the recent memes said something like, expectation: God only gives his toughest battles to his strongest warriors. This is God's plan, Jesus will heal you, etc. Versus the reality in the meme is a couple of doctors are working on a patient, and the white Jesus sort of standing over them, and he's looking down at the doctors working on the patient. He's like, WTF, this is not my plan. So I really love memes like that, but this account is full of them. They're so good, but they're really poking fun at those cultural narratives. And this particular cultural narrative that is about cure and is religious. So I really like that particular meme because it draws together a lot of things that are important to me.
Yeah. The essay has a variety of discussions about different concepts of time: borrowed time, prognostic time, bareback time, crypt time. Can you tell me a little bit about your usages of different forms of time within the essay? Just, kind of tell me about what you think is most important for listeners to know.
Yes, absolutely. So all of these concepts of time I'm talking about them as alternatives to or different from curative time. And curative time is a concept that I get from Alison Kafer, and she describes curative time as time that is assumed to be linear and progressive. So things are always getting better. We're always working on ourselves. We're always working on each other. We're always working toward a cure. Things are always getting better is the assumption whenever we're operating in curative time. So in Fuck the Survivor, I talk about these other ways of experiencing time. So borrowed time is the sense that we're living on time that is borrowed. So everything is really urgent. It sees the day. Really exhausting. It's actually impossible to live like that. It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Living on borrowed time. It's romantic. When you're actually trying to do it, whoa. So that's one of the senses of time that I talk about. Prognostic time is another one. This I get from Lachlan Jane, and this is the sense of time where you're just trying to figure out how much time you have left. So staying up all night, plugging all of your variables into Google, like comparing them to your charts and the medical articles and familiarizing yourself with a whole different vocabulary. How much time do I have left is what you want to know in prognostic time. Bareback time is a sense of time that I get from Tim Dean's work with gay men living during the AIDS crisis who were convinced that it was not a matter of if but when they got AIDS. And so it didn't matter whether they used protection or not. In fact, maybe it was better not to use protection because that would solve this sense of indeterminacy that it was not a matter of if but when. You could just get it now and get it over with, and then you fix that sense of indeterminacy, because it is really hard to live with that sense of indeterminacy. And so again, I recognize that the experience of cancer survivors is different, but I really identified with this whenever I read about it because I shared that sense of indeterminacy, not a matter of if but when the tumors are going to come back is what it really felt like. And so I was just really interested in thinking about how Dean talks about bareback time. I wanted it all to be over.
Yeah.
So those are some of the different ways of time. And cancer, according to Lachlan Jane, is all about time. And I have found that to be true.
I'd love to know a little bit about your thoughts on surviving without optimism, which you write about very beautifully in the essay.
Mm-hmm. This is also a play on something else that Edelman does. Along with Lauren Berlant this time, calls it sex without optimism. But what I mean by survival without optimism is that we don't have to make these demands of curative time on each other. I find that to be a little bit straightforward. And I'll say it again. We don't have to make the demands of curative time on each other. We need each other to create space where we can live with the knowledge that we are going to die and that everything is not going to get better, and that we can experience joy and grief simultaneously. And so when we don't have to foreclose grief in order to get to joy, then we don't have to assume that everything's going to get better. We can learn to live in the moment instead of investing in the future and the promise of a cure that will most likely never come. So we need to learn how to live in between life and death. And for me, I've figured this out in dance spaces where I've learned to live in the moment while still being able to grieve the things that I've lost. And so for me, that's survival without optimism.
Gotcha. You know, these topics I think are super important for everyone to consider, which is why I'm really excited that you're doing this training with Sacred Rites, because these are the kinds of things that I think are so useful for a wide array of people to read about and think about, because all of our deaths are completely certain in this world.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know a little bit about your thoughts on trying to become a more public-facing writer, getting your work out into larger public spheres. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts and goals for working with Sacred Rites on that program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really invested in this because I think that scholars have a lot of stories to tell, not just me, but other scholars as well. Some stories are like mine, that they're personal, theoretical, political, and that they're relevant beyond the academy. But scholars have a nuance in telling these stories that I don't think everyone else necessarily has whenever they're telling their own stories. And so there's a problem there. And there's a problem because the academy has trained us. And this gets back to my very first point, that our personal experiences might bias our scholarship and to think that they're unacademic. So I really think that we're working against these currents whenever we try to tell these really complex, try to tell our stories in really complex and nuanced ways that are accessible and that can help other people think about their experiences differently.
What are some of your own personal goals for your writing to like be widely read and heard as widely as possible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Sacred Rites have been helpful in that they've taught me how to pitch and thinking a little bit more how to pitch. But even here today and thinking about preparing for the interview, even before we really talked and you sent me some questions. Exactly. To think about talking points and what my message really was, so that no matter what the questions are, and your questions were really great. So I didn't have to do a lot of work there. But to prepare me for, even if I was getting bad questions, how could I still get my talking points across?
Sure.
And so things like that, I think, have been really useful in the training. I'm also just interested in really trying to write things and pitch things that are going to be read more widely, and in thinking really intentionally about how to write in ways that are going to make that work.
What are your personal thoughts on the risks, rewards, and responsibilities aspect of the training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I I think about this a little bit differently than Sacred Rites, perhaps. I think a lot about risk in general and how it's necessary to life. And this is really something that I think a lot about with dance as well, and in dance spaces. And we try to act like we don't have to take risks in order to live, or we're constantly trying to mitigate our risks. And we have to take risks. So I do want to think about the risks of public scholarship and be realistic about those, but I also want to live. And so the reward for me is inherent in the risk. And I think about those two together.
Wonderful.
In terms of responsibilities, I could say a little bit more about that. The young adults with cancer that I've met are the people that I think about whenever I think about who I want to be responsible to. And I want to be responsible to the people who are still alive. But there are a number of people that I've met who have died with cancer. And so when I think about responsibilities, I think about Jess and Violet and Matt and Kate and Bradley, who died just a few weeks ago. And they wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. They're very different people, but I want to honor them in some way.
Gotcha. What are you enjoying about being a part of like a cohort, a group of scholars who all come from, maybe some various academic fields with some different life experiences? What are you learning as a part of being part of the group?
hmm The other day, I just had a lovely chat with Dustin Gavin, who I think
Yeah.
has been on the podcast, and his work on queer intimacies and how they're both soft and scary, and they're ways of living through risk and that create a kind of transcendence for him. And I just found so much resonance with what he was saying and my own work and thinking about my own experiences in the medical system and thinking about dance for intimacies as an alternative to submitting your body to that system. And so I think we're learning a lot from each other, even when it's not necessarily always on the very specific topic of how to get our work in the public sphere better. But it's been a lot of fun.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. M. Cooper Minister, do you have any places that you would direct listeners to go if they wanted to check out more of your work or anything like that?
I do have a website at www.cooperminister.com. It is a place where you can see my books, and I'm on Instagram at Cooper Minister. And yes, those are the places that I would direct people.
Fabulous. Well, I've had a real blast today. Thank you so much for joining me. I have learned so much. I'm just so grateful to hear your story and to talk about your life. Thank you for being here.
Thank you again for having me. This has been a lot of fun.